This is a Hope 1032 podcast.
Warning. This episode contains descriptions of domestic violence which may be triggering to some listeners. I'm Georgia and welcome to Finding Hope, the podcast that swaps out the depressing news headlines for stories of hope that won't make the front page. Each episode, we meet someone who's had a bit of a hard road, but has found hope and healing along the way. And hopefully they inspire you to look for the good in your own life as well. Episode 11. Reverend Melissa Lipsett. At 17 years old, Melissa Lipsett ran away from a broken home. She had no hope for her future. She just wanted to get out. Fast forward several decades. She's been ordained in the Uniting Church, and she's now the acting CEO of a major Christian aid organisation, Baptist World Aid Australia. This is a story of resilience, courage and faith, and most of all, God's grace and love in the midst of brokenness. I cannot wait for you to hear Melissa's story. Let's meet her right now. How was your childhood? What was it like growing up?
Well, in many ways, it was an idyllic childhood because I grew up on a farm in country Victoria. So I was surrounded by baby lambs and cows having calves. I had a horse. I helped my father to round cattle on horseback. We roamed the bush. It was in the Grampians Mountains, and we certainly knew the bush paths like the back of our hands. So in many ways it was an idyllic childhood, but unfortunately it was marred by domestic violence, and it was also marred by tragedy in that, I lost my older brother as a young teenager to a farm accident. So whilst idyllic in some ways, far from idyllic in many others.
How did you cope with your older brother's death?
My older brother died when I was 13, as I say, in a farm accident or a motor vehicle accident on the farm. And it was, quite frankly, it was absolutely devastating. My family was already, very, very dysfunctional. And then to add that layer of tragedy and that layer of grief, it did absolutely fall apart past that point. Certainly affected my mother's mental health enormously. She was she became very, very unwell and unstable past that point. And as a mother myself now, I can totally understand and appreciate that. The level of grief was just so overwhelming. So it was literally that. It was catastrophic for our family, and we feel his loss to this day, even though it's many decades later.
Did you grow up in a Christian home?
No, I didn't, Georgia. My parents weren't Christian at all, although I had a grandma who was a Christian, and she was very formative in my life, absolutely no question. And she was powerless to prevent or do anything about the circumstances of our lives in terms of the domestic violence. But I know that she definitely prayed for us, and she provided incredible care and respite from that, from the home environment when it was needed. And that was often.
Was that part of the reason that you joined the Navy at 17?
Yes. I ran away from home to join the Navy, basically. Home life really didn't exist by that point in time. My mother had actually left the family home by that point in time, which was actually a really good thing, incredibly beneficial for her in the long run. And I'm glad she did that. So I was left with my father, and it was an untenable situation. It was an unsafe situation in a whole raft of ways. And the Navy came to town, and I very much saw it as my ticket to a new life. And I grabbed that opportunity and joined the Navy.
What was life like at the Navy?
a lot of people found Navy life very difficult. It's very disciplined. There were a lot of restrictions placed on us, particularly in those early weeks and months and years. But to be honest, given the scenario that I'd come out of, it gave me a real sense of security and safety that I hadn't had before. So, in many ways, I was able to relish in that rather than find it difficult or oppressive. So, I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was quite the adventure for a 17-year-old, no question.
What kind of things did you do? What was your a daily routine?
Well, I joined the Navy as a midshipman, which is a naval officer in training, if you like. I had thought that I was joining the Navy as a cook because I loved cooking, I loved food. But of course, the Navy does psych testing and they determine your career path, not you. And so, it very quickly became apparent that I wasn't going to be a cook at all, that I was being sent off to naval officer training. In those initial months, it was around the discipline rather than the specific technical aspects of the job that was to come. I was allocated to be a communications officer, which is, communications intelligence, those sorts of things. And that specific technical training didn't come until a bit later. So, we did things like firefighting training, we did escaping from enclosed spaces where they're filled with water or smoke or those sorts of things. We did a lot of physical training, which I found quite challenging. I wasn't known for my sporting ability. That was a big challenge for me. We did a lot of marching, a lot of saluting, a lot of flag raising. We also had to do things like small boat training, and we had to get navigation certificates and all of those sorts of things. So it did include going to sea in that first year also, which I don't look back on with a great deal of joy because I discovered that I got very seasick.
No!
So here's this girl from the country who's run off to join the Navy and she gets horrendously seasick. So there was a lot to come to grips with. But at the end of that period of time, after about the first year, I went off to do my specialised communications intelligence training. And I guess there I was much more at home.
In amongst the marching, training and studying, Melissa was trying to find herself and her place in the world. But in doing that, a few years into training, she unexpectedly found something else.
A Navy chaplain opened the pages of the Bible to me and showed me that I wasn't who I thought I was, but I was who God said I was. And that changed my life that day because remembering the circumstances that I'd come from, I wasn't, there was a lot of shame and guilt that had come out of my teenage years. As I said to you before, I tried to live as more out of the home than I had lived in the home. So there's a whole lot of circumstances and behaviour that goes along with that sort of choice, and they were choices that I wasn't proud of. And so yes, I was carrying a lot of shame and guilt into my early 20s, and I was 21 when a naval chaplain opened the pages of the Bible, and it literally changed my life. And I decided that day that if that was who God said I was, that I wanted to know more about this God, and I wanted to become a follower of Jesus. And so I did that day.
How did your life change after that?
Well, the big change was in how I thought about myself, because as I said, lugging around huge quantities of shame and guilt actually aren't good for you. They impact your mental health. They impact the choices that you make, because you make bad choices because you don't think you deserve anything better than that. So how I viewed myself fundamentally changed that day. I started to view myself as through God's eyes, that, God loved me just the way I was, but that he wasn't prepared to leave me that way, that he did want me to change and grow and develop in who I was as a person. And that shifts everything. It really does. It shifts the decisions you make. It affects the relationships you have. It's absolutely enormous. And it's enormous all at once, but it's enormous in its tiny steps as well, if you know what I mean. As I did that, I was also able to come to terms with my family circumstances and, that I no longer harbored, bitterness or unforgiveness, particularly towards my father. And that has served me incredibly well. I have a good relationship with my father today. Being released from things like bitterness about your circumstances at such an early age was, incredibly fortunate. It meant that my decisions were so much better.
We need to backtrack for a minute here because Melissa has a lot of stories to share and they're all connected. The Navy was life-changing for Melissa in so many ways. Her career, studying, finding God. But there was also one man, Pete, who was with her from the start.
I met Pete very early on in those first days and weeks in the Navy. That was part of the safety and security, I guess, not just the Navy environment, but I met somebody who wanted to love me and protect me. And they were still very difficult years in terms of what was happening with my parents. And, he really stepped in to be a buffer between me and my parents and very much loved me as I was. And, I was pretty unlovable, I think. We started dating and we dated throughout that entire period, although we spent very long periods of time apart because given that we were both in the Navy, we were both heading off to various ships. We were both heading off to various, training opportunities. So even though we'd been together for about 4 years by the time I became a Christian, we'd spent a lot of that time apart. And actually, I became a Christian just as we were marrying. So he got a whole different package than he might have expected because I said, I've met Jesus. You have to meet him too. Peter had come from a Catholic family, so he had a greater understanding than I did about Christianity, but his understanding wasn't particularly healthy. God was very gracious, and allowed that exploration to happen together. And incredibly, Peter became a Christian about 6 months after I did.
How did your friends and families react?
I can remember my family in particular were quite negative. As I said, I hadn't come from a Christian family other than my grandma, who was long dead by this point in time. So, yes, it wasn't received particularly with any great enthusiasm. We were fortunate in that we, had a great group of Christian friends to journey with. In fact, one of the first things that I did as a Christian was invite one of my best girlfriends to come to church with me. She also was in the Navy. She and her husband lived next door to us on what was called the married patch on the naval base in the married quarters. And she said, yes, I'll come to church with you. And she also had come from a cultural Catholic background. And she very quickly became a follower of Jesus in a new way. And so it was together that we plotted to get our husbands along to church. And they were our next door neighbours. They were they were Navy colleagues. Her husband was also in the Navy, and they remain some of our greatest friends to this day. And so some of those relationships that we formed with other young Christians have remained with us for life and have been a great blessing to us throughout that time. So when I say that God was gracious, God was and has been gracious in some of those elements of our life. And look, I think that, it was a developing experience for us. So, our understanding of what it meant to be a Christian grew and changed and formed and shaped over a period of time. But certainly there were people who thought we were a bit weird.
That's a good thing. Melissa has worn a lot of hats in her career. After leaving the Navy, she actually fell into full-time ministry.
My husband and I both left the Navy. We moved to Queensland to be with family, and we sought to find a local church that met and by that stage I had 2 small children to meet our needs. And we actually found a local church and had been engaging in that for about 3 months. And actually I was about to start to lead a play group there, and we were about to start to lead a small group there when my husband and I remember this very clearly because it shaped the rest of our life. We were driving to the airport. He had become a Qantas pilot. He was a pilot in the Navy. So I was driving him to the airport for him to catch a flight. And he mentioned a church that was just a couple of streets away from where we lived, which was not the church we had settled in. And he said, I think you should go and check out that church. And I said, why would you say that? That's a really weird thing to say. And he said, I don't know. I just think you should go and check it out. And, we had just settled in another church. We were just about to take on responsibilities in another church. But it was such a weird thing for him to say that I did go and check it out while he was away. It was a magnificent facility, but it was clearly a damaged community. And there were 52 people in the church. I counted them. I sat in the back row and counted them. It was a facility that seated about 450. And as I say, it was damaged by conflict. So, when my husband got home from his international trip, he said, did you go? And I said, yeah, I did, but I won't be going back again. And I explained all of that to him. And then the next time I was driving him to the airport about a week later, he said to me, you have to go back to that church again. I said, what are you talking about? He said, I just can't shift the fact that we're being called to that church. There's something that we have to discover about that church. It's definitely a call. Now, my husband's a very down-to-earth Aussie bloke. He didn't often talk about things like call or what the Holy Spirit might be saying to him, so that it gripped me, and it further gripped me when he said, actually, I think that the call is for you specifically and then our family. So, and I think I said to him at the time, you work out your own calling, buddy, and leave me to work out mine. But again, because it was such a specific Holy Spirit call statement that was so unlike him in terms of nature and character, that I couldn't shift it at that point. And so I returned again to that church to try to discern what the Holy Spirit was saying. And it became very clear to me that it was a call. I didn't understand that call, but I felt it that time too.
Melissa, although confused, was not uncertain. She knew this was a call from God. And she soon became heavily involved with this new church, starting a playgroup, which took off quickly.
Well, the playgroup grew and we ended up having playgroup 5 days a week. It was a Christian playgroup. We sought to provide opportunities for families to move from playgroup into the worshipping life of the church, into the community there. It began to grow around us. It was a story of God's grace and provision and growth. I was fortunate and privileged to be invited into ministry in firstly that lay capacity and then in a paid capacity. And over the years, each role that I took on, I had been prepared for in the previous one, but each one was a leap, if you like, a stretch. Again, God was incredibly gracious, and somewhere along the line, I decided I needed to get theologically trained, and so I did that, and eventually was ordained in the Uniting Church. I and my family remained at that church for nearly 20 years. And over that period of time, on my first Sunday there was 52 people. On my last Sunday there was somewhere around about 1,800 worshipping every Sunday.
It can be hard to know when to step aside as a leader. But Melissa knew that after 20 years, it was time to move on.
I'm absolutely passionate about making a difference in the world. And at my age, Georgia, you've got a limited time frame in which to make that difference. I want to make a significant contribution that lasts after I've gone. And, that's always been my deepest desire. And that desire has only deepened and grown as I've got older. And so, there was a point which I knew that it was time to step out of the local church, mostly because I had got older and it was a much younger congregation. And, as a leader, you should constantly be raising up new leaders. And so at some point you have to step out and let new leaders have it. And that's always very, very difficult to do, to know when to step aside. But I think it's a really important thing that we do as leaders.
What a story of grace and provision. From a broken home to the Navy to becoming a reverend, Melissa has been truly blessed. But her story doesn't end there. Since then, she's held many titles. Chief Operating Officer at Bible Society Australia, and she's also currently the Chief Operating Officer and Acting CEO of Baptist World Aid Australia.
I absolutely love what I'm doing. The organisation is great people doing really good work, strong foundation of faith. And I think it is, at this stage of my life, it is absolutely my sweet spot, that the organisation's purpose absolutely lines up with my greatest passion, which is around the alleviation of poverty and injustice, in Jesus' name, really.
Melissa, what does being a Christian leader mean to you?
Well, being a Christian is who I am first and foremost. So it informs everything about me. It informs what I do, how I do it, how I choose to think. So leadership is a part of that. My Christianity must inform my leadership. My leadership must be different from a secular environment because I'm a Christian. So first and foremost, I would say that I'm a servant leader, that I lead by example, that I come alongside people, that I love people first and foremost. I care about them first and foremost. Every part of my leadership must be informed by my Christianity, just like every part of our lives must be informed by our Christianity as Christians. We can't just be one day a week Christians. Our Christianity has to inform us, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Does that mean I'm perfect? No, far from it. I make as many mistakes as the next person, possibly more.
What would you say are the biggest challenges that you face in, achieving that Christian leadership?
I think my greatest challenge is helping Christians to understand, in the Christian leadership space, speaking to Christians about what I believe God is calling us to as Christians. And perhaps that's why there was a point at which I stepped out of the local church, because I felt like there is a life outside the local church, that the local church should prepare us to serve outside in our 24/7 lives. And I think many of us think of being on the roster on Sunday is our Christian service. No, it's actually about how we're serving the poor, the lonely, the marginalised, the prisoner. All of those, that is our call as Christians and as the church. And so if I have any frustration, it's about how I as a Christian leader speak to other Christians and say, forget the small life that you've built for yourself. There is actually a much bigger life and a much bigger calling that God is calling every single one of us as Christians to, that we have a sphere of influence that we should all be speaking into. God is calling us to change the world. Probably my frustration is about, do Christians really understand that? Do Christians really understand the difference that God is calling us to make? Do we understand our capacity alongside God to make a difference? Are we actually doing it?
Lastly, Melissa, I ask this at the end of every podcast episode. Might be a bit of a broad one for you because you've had a lot of experiences, but how are you different now?
As a 17-year-old running away to join the Navy, I was looking for an escape from everyday life, the life that I knew. And now looking back, I'm just so grateful for everything that's happened during my life. I'm not grateful for those circumstances, but I'm grateful for the way that God has used those circumstances. And so, as I look back over my life, I can see this pattern of those things that I might have considered to be the most difficult. God has been able to appropriate those and use them in new ways. And so I guess that's the beauty from ashes that we read about in the Bible, isn't it? That God is able to use me because of those things, not just in spite of them.
Thank you so much to Melissa for sharing her story on finding hope. If you or someone you know is impacted by domestic or family violence, call 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800-737-732 or visit www.1800respect.org.au, and that information is in the show notes. To read more about the wonderful work of Melissa and Baptist World Aid Australia and how you or your church can support them, that information is also in the show notes. And if you or someone you know, as always, has a story of hope to share and you'd like to be interviewed for this podcast, I would love to hear from you. You can leave a comment on the Finding Hope page at hopepodcasts.com.au. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to get future episodes in your feed, and tell a friend about it as well. We're just over halfway through the season, but plenty of fantastic episodes to come this year. You can also leave a review on whatever platform you are listening from, and you can tell us what you love about the podcast there. I'm Georgia, and thank you for listening to this episode of Finding Hope. I'll leave you with this passage from Isaiah 61, which is one of Melissa's favourites. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me, to proclaim good news to the poor, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes. Catch you next time.
This is a Hope 1032 production. Thanks for listening.